Hi, everybody, and oi, bom dia to all my brasileiros out there. This, as you can tell by my not booming Scott Lloyd radio voice, this is one of our special sessions. I have talked quite a bit about how we need to focus a little bit less, I think, on Germany when we are looking at tyrants and what's going on in America, because that seems to be one of the only examples a lot of America understands. I have suggested that understanding some Latin American dictatorships and their journey to dictatorship could also help us understand America. And y'all asked me to find some English speaking resources for that. So I'm very, very excited to welcome Dr. Bryan Pitts to have a special discussion about Brazil, the military dictatorship over there, the differences and the similarities to the US, and his insights into what is going on in our country right now and maybe what we can do, but mostly just his expertise. Bryan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to join you today.
Awesome. Well, would you give us the rundown on who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm the assistant director of UCLA's Latin American Institute. I got my PhD in Latin American history from Duke and a master's in Latin American studies from Vanderbilt. And all of my research has been on Brazil, on race and ethnicity in Brazil, sexuality in Brazil, and also most relevant for our purposes today, late 20th century Brazilian politics and contemporary Brazilian politics. Ever since I went to Brazil for the first time in 1999, I've been obsessed with it. And so I'm excited. Talking about Brazil is like the most exciting thing I can do.
Which is excellent because that's also true for me. And for listeners, maybe you don't know, I grew up in Brazil. So I was born into the Children of God cult, which went international missionary group in the mid 70s when things were heating up for cults in America. And I ended up actually being born in the Philippines as the Marcos dictatorship was coming down, and then spending some time in Japan, a little bit of time in Peru, and then a decade in Brazil. I got to Brazil in, I believe, 1993 when I was about 4. No,
Come to think of it,
that's not correct. 91, I got to Brazil.
When I did my undergraduate at Oral Roberts University, and I had a friend there, and I'm almost certain that his parents were in Children of God as well.
Yeah, I think it's, for a lot of us that were just raised around the globe and then trying to come home and be Americans. I had a very strange experience coming to America from Brazil for the first time when I was 14. And growing up, English was the first language, didn't learn Portuguese till I was about 10 because we were pretty secluded. And saying, "Soy Americana," and then we landed in LA. And the two things that stood out to me the most was all the signs were in English. I'd never seen that before. I was like, it's so loud because everyone's, English is coming straight into my brain, which I could sort of tune out Portuguese as a second language, I think. And then also when we walked outside and there's just houses, nice 5-bedroom houses on the street. And you don't really see that in Brazil. When I was leaving Brazil, it was still glass bottles on the tops of compound, walls around the rich houses, but they were just starting to switch them out for electric fencing.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Now it's instead of the broken glass bottles.
Yeah. So super interesting. And, something else that I remember stood out to me was my aunt is trying to find the apartment complex she's driven us to in San Diego. And she pulls over to the side of the road and asks maybe a 10 or 12-year-old black boy in English for directions. And he answered, and I was like, whoa. And I'd met Brazilians who spoke English. And we, of course, as fake missionaries, worked a lot in the favelas and with these poor kids. And it was just people have said to me, oh, Brazilians don't have racism. And I'm like, no, they do. Because I remember being very stunned that this little black boy could speak English. I had never seen that before. And, I was aware, you talked about on a podcast that I listened to that even from a very young experience, also with missionary parents in South America, that you were kind of subconsciously aware that some of these things like poverty were like structural issues?
Yeah, it's funny because I didn't get that certainly explicitly through, anything I heard at, the church we were from in the United States. I describe us as being sort of Bapticostals because we combine the fire and brimstone of the Baptists with the speaking in tongues of the Pentecostals. It's the best or perhaps worst of both worlds, depending on how you look at it. And so, there's been a lot of research done on how American missionaries globally are bringing not only Christianity, but also a very specific American understanding of the way the world should work, right? One that is very individualistic, one that is very capitalist. And, not that my parents were preaching politics. They did a really good job of staying away from that, actually. But there's sort of some assumptions, right, that people bring with them that influence the way that they share their faith. And so the kind of faith we were sharing was probably that more individualist, capitalist American sort of faith. But what I saw in front of me was very different, right? We were missionaries in Bolivia, in indigenous villages where people certainly didn't speak English, or didn't even speak Spanish, much less English, right? It was mostly Aymara and Quechua. And, you saw these people who, my parents were founding churches among people who were indigenous subsistence farmers. And, it was very clear that the reason they were poor was not because they weren't working hard enough, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're literally backbreaking labor in the fields to try to grow enough potatoes to get their family through to get their family through the next year, and could not get ahead no matter what they did because the deck was so stacked against them as a result of 2 centuries of racism and social exclusion. And I didn't really have the language to describe that, of course, as an 11-year-old, but I saw it. And later when I learned about, things like structural inequality, I was like, that's what I saw when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Missionaries prepare me in a couple of ways, right? Have much more progressive politics today than one might expect, both through that and just through being raised in another culture and realizing that there's other ways to look at the world other than the one that, the people around me in the United States have.
Yeah. And like will be so interesting to my listeners because I have an audience full of like missionary kids and cult babies. And, you know, it's first of all, I sort of think it's impossible to brainwash children because they're all like young children because they're always questioning and not really buying in. But I think it's interesting. I always say like the children of God started off racist, like so many of these 60s cults did. And like we were literally taught 18th century, Black people are cursed sons of Ham, evangelical doctrine to justify slavery. Like we were taught that, but then they raised us all over the world. And so they kind of like broke it a little bit, because we were not only absorbing what we were deliberately being taught, we were also absorbing the things that we were seeing out in the world. And I find this to be like a common theme with a lot of the missionary kids. Like,
Well, and
yeah,
whether it was intentional or not, certainly, if you're 9 years old and your parents say, we're going to sell everything we own, we're going to move to another country where people speak a different language, you're going to be homeschooled from now on. And the reason we're doing this is because God loves these Black and brown people as much as he loves us and wants to have a relationship with them. Then, despite all the many problematic attitudes towards race among evangelicals, that was a good thing that I got out of it, right? Like the assumption that
yeah.
God loved everybody equally and wanted everybody to have the same chance at, quote unquote, eternal life. That was actually a good message that I got out of it. I've learned as an adult, right, that like this sort of, when I look back at my cult approximate childhood and all I can see are the bad things about it, and I'm like continuing to let that trauma define me. And, I can also today recognize the good things that I got out of it. There might have been more bad things sometimes, but there were good things too.
Yeah, but and I talk about this a lot on my channel that that's part of what deconstruction and or, going back as an adult and going through those things that you got from it gives you. I always say like I speak fluent Portuguese and Spanish and I can now speak to half of the world in their language. I'm putting Culting of America into Spanish at least, maybe Portuguese, and like that's a good thing. I was trafficked through Mexico as a 14 and 15-year-old as a carnival clown through Mexico and lower Texas. But like I made balloon animals at my kids' kindergarten graduation. So, and again, like this thing of like, they can verbally say things are because of X. But we can see outside of that, which I also think speaks to like isolation is such an important part of like brainwashing and control. And that was one of the things, at least for me, especially when I started doing, anti-racism work myself. And I could think back and go, as a child, when I was surrounded by white people, I was very unsafe. But when I was out in public, we were performers, being paraded around like Brazilians who are predominantly brown and black, at least in the places I was, were being wonderful to us, so it's been a thing even in my adult life that I have noticed that like I feel safer when I'm around more diverse crowds, even though that's not in any way what they were trying to teach us, I don't think.
I think what they're trying to teach us and what we got out of it are two very different things. And I mean, like you said, I can't imagine my life without the exposure to Latin America that I had as a kid and without Brazil. I wouldn't have studied the things that I studied. I wouldn't have the career that I have. I'd have a very different life. I can't imagine what my life would be like without those years as a kid in Bolivia.
And I always say, even though I had to grow up in like one of the worst cults ever, at least I got to experience some other cultures. Like there are kids that grew up in cults in Ohio. Like I'm glad I got to, have that experience. So to turn to the dictatorship, um, I was growing up in Brazil in 1991, and I have the vaguest notions of like, I remember moving to the US as a teenager and being like, oh, social services, like, oh, things work in a different way. And I have been sort of like illegally moved through countries and through borders. But it's been very interesting to sort of hear you talk about and also follow Brazilian politics to see like, didn't they have a military dictatorship kind of come out of that and then build a bit of a stronger democracy than we have here?
Yes, Brazil's had a great variety of governments over its history. A lot of people don't know that after independence in 1822, Brazil had the New World's only extended experiment with monarchy. Brazil was an empire with a son and grandson of the Portuguese monarch as its emperor from 1822 to 1889. Then in the 1930s, Brazil had a dictator who at different times kind of vacillated between being an American ally and being a fascist, but with the support of the military, but a very different kind of dictatorship. There was a democracy for 20 years, and then in 1964, a military coup that led to the dictatorship that I study, and the one that I think we're going to talk about mostly today, which lasted for 21 years until 1985. So Brazilians have, like, in living memory, there's an experience of dictatorship. There's an experience of what it looks like when when a group, well, in this case, seizes power, but I guess also when you elect someone who does not share the same democratic and constitutional norms as the country is supposedly founded upon.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The first place I lived in Brazil, by the way, was Petrópolis, which is where the king, at least the last
Yes.
king of Brazil, and I always found it so funny because it's like he built his himself a city on one mountain and then the queen a city on a whole other mountain. And I'm like, that's some kind of passive aggressiveness toward your spouse, right? Like,
Yeah, I mean, we were close, but not.
I'm going to put you on a whole different mountain. Something I get told a lot by Brazilians anytime I bring up the military dictatorship is that it was caused by the CIA. Could you expand on that? Like the American CIA destabilized the country and then sort of led to that?
So I am not one to ever deny the insidious influence of the United States, both in Latin America and global. But it's too simplistic to say that the coup was carried out by the CIA. The coup was carried out by a coalition of right-wing elements in the Brazilian military and right-wing elements among the country's political elite. And one of the reasons why it worked was because it was made very clear by the CIA and by the U.S. military that they would welcome such a thing. And in fact, we'll get to this later, but one reason why the attempt at a military coup in Brazil in late 2022 and early 2023 didn't work is because, to its credit, the Biden administration made it very clear that they would support no such thing. So, kind of having I would say the role of the United States in Brazil in 1964 was probably not as direct as the role of the U.S. in Chile in 1973, for example, or in Guatemala in 1954. But still, would it have happened without U.S. support? Possibly, but it's much less likely.
Okay. Fascinating, because I am always trying to understand like what we know as Americans versus sort of what the real story is. Actually, one of the interesting things in my life was being a little swallowed up by US military propaganda during and just after my service, and then having South American friends be like, don't you think it's a little weird how worshipful the US is of the military versus kind of the more Latin American attitude of having a maybe a healthy fear of your military?
Yeah, I mean, another difference too. You think about how, or something I've noticed in recent years, right? The sort of like acceptance of like the sort of uncritical acceptance of U.S. propaganda, right? Like in the 1960s, the excuse was communism, right? The United States had to support a coup in Brazil because if they didn't, Brazil become communist, right? And become just like Cuba. Today, we don't really have that excuse anymore, and so the idea of Brazil becoming a Soviet satellite is not, not too many people would believe that's viable. But like an article that I co-authored with several other scholars of Brazil in 2023 indicated, what the U.S. has used in more recent years is anti-corruption discourse. And so, this government, it's okay for this government to be removed. In the case in Brazil, a democratically elected government in 2016 to be removed by sort of extra legal or semi-legal means. It's justified because there's corruption, right?
It's
And so instead of
corruption.
communism being the bugaboo, now corruption is.
Yeah. And there's so much racism, I think, involved in that. But I mean, I think one of the things we are going through right now in America is discovering how much corruption there maybe always has been in our government
Well, if not
versus
if not more, right? Because, what I
right.
always tell people is, like in Brazil, these corruption scandals in the early 2010s that revolved around the state oil company, right? Overinflated contracts for the companies that were doing, that were building for the oil company, and then some of the extra money from these overinflated contracts went to the, oil companies, some went to the construction companies, and some went to politicians, but they didn't go to like buy yachts for politicians. What they went to was into politicians' campaign funds. Why was this? Because in Brazil, corporate campaign contributions are illegal. And so the whole reason you had this structure of corruption to support political campaigns was because in Brazil, they don't allow things that we do allow in the United States. Like, sure, our campaigns are quote unquote less corrupt here. We just legalize the corruption through Citizens United. And so it's easy to say that our country is not corrupt when we legalize the
Right.
corruption.
Sounds like a rant that my pilot husband goes on, that the way airlines keep their stats up for being on time is if they know they're going to be not on time, they change the time.
Yeah.
So they're always on time. Could you explain to us the book that you wrote and sort of like where the title comes from and this concept during the Brazilian dictatorship?
Yeah, so my book was published by University of California Press in 2023. It's based on my doctoral dissertation in Latin American history. And the title is Until the Storm Passes, Politicians, Democracy, and the Demise of Brazil's Military Dictatorship. And the book, generally in most studies of the military dictatorship in the past, when trying to explain like why did the dictatorship fall, the explanations tended to be either because the generals got tired of being in power, or they were Democrats at heart, and so they decided to give power back to the people, or because civil society rose up and forced the military out of power. And both of those have elements of truth in them. But what didn't get looked at as often, or at least in a very comprehensive way, was the role of the country's political elite, what Brazilians call the political class. And whether that is a term whether it is a class in the Marxist sense, that's a whole debate that many reviewers brought up in discussing my book. But the term political class is what Brazilians use to refer to this sort of cabal of people that has been in power. In many cases, their families have been in power since for 500 years. To this day, the greatest predictor in Brazil of like,
Yeah.
you be a politician was your father, or sometimes your mother a politician. And so this sort of cabal of people that were united often by blood, but certainly by shared socialization, going to the same universities, often marrying into the same families. This group of people who ruled the country pretty much uninterrupted for the last several hundred years, certainly since independence. And the military comes in and says, we're going to push you aside and we're going to run the country now. Politicians didn't really take well to that. And so the struggle to overthrow the dictatorship is also a struggle of the country's civilian political elite to reassert its power. And sort of the central argument of the book is that they couldn't do that by themselves. And so um, in order to force the military out, they were forced to accept a much greater level of popular mobilization and after the dictatorship fell, a much more expansive democracy than Brazil had ever had in the past. Because the only way they're going to get rid of these generals was to allow more power to ordinary people.
Yeah, that's so cool. And I just want to say for the audience, like, you did a great job of adapting the book from a dissertation. I'm not usually a fan of books that start off as dissertations first because they're not that readable sometimes, but you did such a great job, and it's an exciting book. I so a couple of interesting things, because I believe you talked about this military class as well, right? Which was sort of the middle class. Correct me if I'm wrong. You said Brazil's one of the only modern countries that still hasn't had land reform, which sort of blew
Correct.
my
In Latin America.
mind. Yeah. And so getting into the middle class was sort of going through the military was a good way versus, I mean, in America, that's also true. Like, the military is a social elevator, but we had definitely a middle class that was sort of intentionally created by the founding fathers, I think, to be a barrier in between them and like everyone else.
Well, this may not be so different from the US, but I think one thing that certainly is more pronounced in Brazil, right, is that in the United States, at least since industrialization, maybe 10% of the country is rich, 70% of the country is theoretically middle class, and 20% of the country is working class or poor, right? In Brazil, that 70% and 20% have historically been reversed, right? Maybe 20% falls into the middle class, 70% are working class, or have you know nothing to their names. And so what that means is historically the middle class in Brazil has aligned itself more with the interests of the upper class than with the working class. And so it's been one thing that has been it might be a little bit different too. Historically, like, being in the middle class is, like being one step down from the elite. But as far as the military goes,
Yeah.
the military has historically been a middle class institution in Brazil. In some ways, right, it could be a way to ascend socially, right? But usually in Brazil, it was the officers that came from middle class families. Your average rank and file soldier, just like in the United States, came from working class families. They didn't have a choice, or earlier during the empire, were just forced into military service. That was something that happened really commonly as well. And it wasn't really common, right? If you're brought in as a private and you're Afro-Brazilian, you're probably not making it to an officer, right? And so you also had, not as maybe pronounced as the political class, but historically, and I don't know if this is still true to the same extent today, but in Brazil, the greatest indicator of whether you might be a military officer is, was your father a military officer? And so there was this hereditary component to the officer corps as well, that was exacerbated by the fact that to this day, in the Brazilian military, they have their own high schools, right, which the children of officers go to. And I don't think they still do it, but certainly until recently, like, they had their own curriculums, like they had their own history textbooks, which were written to favor the military. And so, you wind up with sort of indoctrinating a new generation of future officers into this idea that this heroic military government came along to save Brazil from communism, and which is why you still have these anti-democratic, quasi-democratic, reluctantly democratic elements in the armed forces too.
Yeah, I had an interesting experience. So I was raising my kid in Portuguese for about 5 years. I did this very, speaking only Portuguese. I spent a lot of time on my Portuguese. I made connections. I got invited to speak to the Brazilian security industry, like security and intelligence industry kind of club. And then also to go to the Brazilian Military Academy and speak to some of their like women, because they're finally getting women there for the first time. And I was one of the first women on an American like ground combat team, but just also I am an American military officer who speaks Portuguese. And I gave what I thought was a cool talk to the intelligence security industry, talking about like the heart of doing intelligence work is getting outside of your own culture enough to appreciate another culture as a valid culture to be able to predict. And here I am with my, sotaque americana accent giving this talk. However, they immediately, one of the first questions was, because this was in 2020, do you support Trump? And when they figured out that I was left-leaning Democrat, they were very quick to inform me the Brazilian military is very, very right-leaning, and I need to be careful what I talk about. I was like, okay.
Well, that itself is also a product of the dictatorship, right? Because before 1964, there was a pretty significant leftist element in the military as well. Those were all purged in 1964 and were forcibly retired. With powers that the military regime sort of arbitrarily gave itself. So there was a time when the Brazilian military was much more ideologically diverse than it is today.
Yeah, that makes sense too. And I do want to say, like, the U.S. military is still incredibly sort of classist in a way that I couldn't even really clock, because I'm the class jumpingest person ever. I came to America with $0 at 15 on my own and sort of put myself through high school and college, stumbled into the military as an officer, ended up dating someone in a lower officer class and marrying, and it was an issue and I couldn't understand why. And this was when I was sort of educated on like the US military, especially the officer classes. Like, it's still very sort of the people who go to West Point and the naval academies and these kinds of things are still these old families, these families where everyone has been, an infantry officer. And there's still sort of a lot of class policing in that way, even though in theory we say we're not, I guess similar to what you were saying about the corruption.
I think that's exacerbated in the United States by the fact that, and there's a really good Brazilian parallel to this. I think we're sort of trained to not see class in the U.S., right? And that's because sort of our founding national myth. I've asked students in teaching class before, like, what is the one thing that you have to believe in order to be an American? The American dream, right? That it doesn't matter where you come from. It doesn't matter, who your parents are. If you work hard, you can get ahead. What is the American dream if not a denial of social class, right? And so we don't see it because the very idea that classes exist is almost un-American. And Brazil has a parallel to this, but in Brazil, the national myth is not that there's no class. In Brazil, the national myth is that there's no race. The idea of a racial democracy, that Brazil is a country that never had Jim Crow, that peacefully abolished slavery, and a country where there is no racism and everyone lives together in happy multicultural harmony. Which is not true. Brazil is a profoundly racist country, but it means that to even suggest that racism existed was once seen as really anti-Brazilian, right? The ones who were creating racism, it was said were the ones who were trying to create divisions among Brazilians by saying that race was important, which is exactly the way class gets talked about when people want to shut down in arguments about inequality in the United States. So that is a great example to me of how
also the way
we understand what's going on in our own country more if we understand what's going on in Brazil.
Yeah. I absolutely love the wording of your question, because in my book, and this is like my contribution to cult scholarship, I call it the sacred assumption. And I say it's the one thing you must believe to be a member in good standing of this group. Like, I'm sure you're Pentecostal. What did you call it? Baptist-costal.
Yeah.
Like, there was something, I'm like, in the children of God, we believed that our leader was the prophet of God. And so then anything he said, like, goes. In the American army, we believe that the American flag is worth dying for, like America's worth dying for. But then I asked my husband about his special operations pilot unit. I was like, what's the sacred assumption? And he said, oh, literally dying for your country. Like, if you retire alive, they're not cool with you. So, finding these different sacred assumptions. I think this is so interesting, and not to spend too much time on my personal experience, but my listeners do like it. I am, I think, like as much a recipient of the American dream as anyone. And the first time I heard the term white privilege, someone was trying to use me to prove that white privilege didn't exist. They were like, you of all people, Captain Mestyanek, should know that white privilege is not a thing. And I was like, oh, that's the term for it, like that's the term. Because the only term I had before that was like, I get treated better than I should as kind of like an indigent teenager in America. And I think there's so many ways, but I also think that whatever was left of the American dream, like I was the last generation that could work their way through college with a package of scholarships and grants. And, it was maybe 10 grand a year, and now it's 40. And one of the ways that even the whole thing about the middle class was explained to me, like one of the things that made America kind of unique, at least early on, was having a larger middle class than working class. And I think in many ways, our government has destroyed a lot of that, like destroyed the American dream,
Over the last
destroyed
40
the
years,
middle
certainly.
class. Yeah.
The
And
middle class now is paycheck to paycheck as much as the working class almost.
yeah. What do you think about, so I keep saying like, okay, so what do we expect to see over the next 4 years? And I'm like, I kind of said when he got elected, I expect this to start looking more and more like some of these Latin American dictatorship countries that we tend to look down on. And people say, what does that mean? And I'm like, well, I expect to see walls going up around fancy neighborhoods or houses, right? Because how are you going to protect your castles when they come for your food? We're already starting to have slum villages here in the US. Spent a lot of my childhood being drug around favelas, and like have that kind of, in a weird way, I think they have a lot more community in the slum villages than in the regular society sometimes. What do you think? Wait, based on what you know of Brazil and Latin America, what do you think we might expect to see over the next 4 years of sort of march toward dictatorship?
So my caveat here is I always think Brazil is the best comparison. So I might not be the most impartial person here, but I get that, like you and I were talking about before we started recording, right? One of the comparisons that comes up a lot now is comparison to Nazi Germany, right? Even I don't want to say setting aside, but like the gas chambers have not been built yet, but that's not to say that they're not being built. So that could happen, although it's not yet. But what really sets us apart from Nazi Germany is that German fascism was not unabashedly capitalist or liberal like American economic model. I'm not an
Mm,
expert on Germany by any means, but my understanding is there was a much greater role for the government in the economy under German fascism. A way that would horrify Republicans and libertarians in the United States. And so perhaps on a level like, racism, blaming people who look different or come from a different religion or background for the country's problems. Yeah, it has that element of fascism. It doesn't have the economic element, right? And so in that sense, it's different. With the Brazilian dictatorship and the Latin American dictatorships more broadly, especially Argentina and Chile, it has not only sort of the blaming communists slash immigrants slash trans people, whoever the enemy of the day is for the country's problems, and throwing in prison people you disagree with. It also has the economic model in common, in that part of the reason there was a military coup in Brazil was because the military had to protect private property from communism. So they thought. Even the Brazilian military was much less libertarian than what we have in our economic system today, but it's much closer, right? And I think there's a lot of other ways that what we have right now in the U.S. looks a lot more like the Latin American military dictatorships than it does like Nazi Germany, largely because I think, perhaps we're forgetting, certainly some people on the right are forgetting those lessons. But, it was one of the lessons of World War II is like there are other ways to accomplish your objectives than by killing 20 million people, right? You can, in the case of Argentina or Chile, you can kill 3,000 or 30,000. And
yeah,
Brazil, about 500 people and still get what you
terror
want.
model.
And so in that sense of like a little bit smaller scale of the violence, although of course what's going on with ICE right now could argue against that. But a little bit smaller scale for the violence is so far something else that we have in common with the Latin American military dictatorships.
Yeah, I also think I have said there's two interesting things about Brazil that are similar to the US. One is just size, like it's still 211 million people versus 350. So we have a lot more people, but Germany's smaller than Texas. And then also the multiculturalism, because in countries where you've really ended up with totalitarian nations, like Germany, at least the promise that they were trying to give Germans, or like North Korea, is you kind of have a monoculture, or at least the promise that if you go against these few groups of people, you're going to have a monoculture. And I think, first of all, I also think Trump thinks this is Germany and he can just take someone else's playbook and like put it to work here, and it's not going well. But I do think that the sort of the multiculturalism, and then the size meaning like it's hard to control huge amounts of people over mass amounts of territory by force, at least in the US with all our guns, for sure.
Yes, I agree. And one thing I like to tell students when it comes to sort of illustrating the size of Brazil, two things that blow everybody's mind. I asked them, when you're in the northernmost state of Roraima and the southernmost state of Rio Grande do Sul, you're the same. You're about the same distance as you are between which two American cities. So, like, I don't know, like New York and Chicago. No, it's the same distance as Seattle and Miami. In fact, when you're in the very northern tip of Brazil on the border with Venezuela, you are closer to Canada than you are to the very southern tip of Brazil on the border with Uruguay. So that's one way in which Brazil is similar to the U.S. It is a country of continental proportions. And certainly in terms of diversity and immigration as well, you hit the nail right on the head. Not just in terms of sort of the classic mixture that Brazilians see as being part of their culture, which is European, indigenous, and African. But Brazil has also been a destination for immigration over the years, not to the same scale as the U.S., but in Sao Paulo, there's a huge percentage of people who are descended from Italians or descended from Portuguese. More recently, there was a lot of Syrian Lebanese immigration to Brazil. And the one that really surprises people who don't know as much about Brazil, there are more people of Japanese descent
Japanese.
in the city of Sao Paulo than there are in the rest of the world combined outside of Japan.
This is a fun fact I like to tell Americans. I'm like, yeah, best sushi outside of Japan is in like Brazil. Because
And then,
it's
more recently,
amazing.
there's been Bolivian immigration, Paraguayan immigrations from other countries in Latin America as well. And so, in terms of cultural diversity, Brazil's not on a level with the U.S. I think a few years ago, I don't know if this is still true, but about 15% of the U.S. population was foreign born. In Brazil, under 1% of the population is foreign born, and so, or at least wasn't in recent years. And so there is a little bit less exposure to other. I joke that like you can get a greater variety of restaurants in my hometown of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, than you can in Sao Paulo,
Wow. Yeah.
which might be a bit of an exaggeration, but there's certainly better Vietnamese food in Baton Rouge than there is in Sao Paulo. And so, but Brazil does have this. There's no sort of ethnic identity, right, that is seen as being Brazilian. And in fact, this is
Yeah.
something we have in the Americas that that really distinguishes us from Europeans in that national belonging here. Nowhere in the Americas is national belonging explicitly based upon a racial identity. It's always, at least discursively, based on, do you share our civic ideals? And that's a completely different foundation for citizenship than you have anywhere in the old world, with maybe the partial exception of the French Republic. But this idea that membership is based on civic belonging as opposed to racial identification is something uniquely American. I mean, in the big sense of America as opposed to the United
Yeah.
States.
I have so I have 25 siblings because sex cult. And I was born in the Philippines and I do not have Filipino citizenship. And my sister, who was born in Japan, does not have Japanese citizenship. But all of my siblings who are born in Brazil and Mexico have citizenship. And by the way, in case you don't know this, listeners, when Donald Trump said we were the only country with birthright citizenship, it was just a lie. It's just a lie. I'm pretty
The
sure.
entire Americas, with a couple of, I think the Dominican
I think
Republic
not.
changed
I
it
heard
recently
not
because they didn't want
Colombia
people.
either.
You could be right. I know the Dominican Republic did it because of Haitian immigration. They changed it not that long ago, and I don't know when Colombia might have changed it, but historically in the Americas, it's been. I mean, you look at a map of the world, and countries that have birthright citizenship are, with a couple of exceptions, in the New World, and the countries that don't have it are, with only a couple of exceptions, in the Eastern Hemisphere.
Yeah, it's so interesting to describe like the cultural stuff in Brazil versus Mexico. I always say like in Brazil versus the US. I always say, like, in the US, we have this idea that we're the melting pot, but I think we're maybe a little bit more the stir fry. Like, we bring all the pieces here, but they're just next to each other. In Brazil, you have a little bit more of the melting pot. I think, like, feijoada is the national food, and like, I, and tell me, actually, this is just for me, for my spy brain. I have always heard that the Brazilian passport is the most expensive passport you can get on the black market.
Because no matter what you look like, you could be Brazilian.
Right. Because I always tell people, I'm like, there's a look that is Brazilian. Like my friend Micaela, I don't think she could be from anywhere else if you know like that look that is Brazilian. But there's also no look that is not Brazilian.
Exactly.
Like when I was 11 years old, someone asked me if I was from Santa Catarina, and I was just so flattered that my Portuguese was like, I guess, getting good enough that they just thought I was from the state that has all the white people.
Yeah, every once in a while, somebody in Brazil will think that I'm from southern Brazil. I don't have the accents, but my Portuguese is good enough to where they might be like, maybe you're from somewhere in Brazil whose accent I'm not familiar with. But yeah,
They
just
can
on the way I
absolutely
look, I guess I could be
they can
Gaúcho.
absolutely never figure me out because, I always say like I speak Spanish too, but American or Spanish speakers meet tons of non-Spanish,
Exactly.
non-Spanish original speaking people who speak Spanish, but Brazilians, being the invisible giant of the South Americas, like
When we
rarely
actually,
meet people who are like not, Brazilian in affiliation or family that speak Portuguese and love Brazil. So that's always fun.
I think one of the good ways of illustrating this, at least anecdotally, is I've had American friends who have done DNA testing to see where their families come from, and I've had Brazilian friends who do it. And even Brazilian friends who look a lot like me come back as 25 or 30% West African. I had one aunt that
Wow.
came back as 2% West African, but it's not a big part of my family tree. And so you see that in the United States. I mean, because of things like the one drop rule here. Um,
Right.
most people who don't identify as Black have very little African ancestry. Whereas in Brazil, you can consider yourself white, but probably have over 50% African ancestry. But then just to illustrate, at the same time, Brazil is this melting pot. How racist it is. The way Brazilians have historically described that is to describe the fact that everybody has a little bit of African heritage is todo mundo, which means everybody's got a foot in the kitchen, i.e., everybody's got a little bit of like the cook or the maid in their background. So
It's
equating
bad.
African
Yeah.
ancestry with domestic labor is an illustration of how Brazil's racial democracy is not even skin deep.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's so fascinating. Can you talk a little bit about the politician Tancredo Neves, who said to the younger politician, I believe, like, wait until the storm passes, and what that meant for the dictatorship and maybe what that might mean for us?
So Tancredo was at the time one thing about Brazil is politicians all get called by their first names. Nobody refers to them by their last name. So Tancredo Neves, who Brazilians know as Tancredo, had been a federal congressman since the early 1960s. So he was already a congressman before the military coup in 1964, and he was like notorious for being very diplomatic. Might be a nice way to put it. Having no ideological principles might be another way to put it. Um, But as the dictatorship wore on and there was less and less room for the political elite to maneuver and more attacks on democratic institutions, you had some congressmen in the opposition, largely men, there were a few women, some Congress people in the opposition who wanted to take a much more confrontational attitude towards the generals. And Tancredo told one of them, he's like, no, my son, he's like, this is not the way you do it. He's like, don't put your chest on the tip of the bayonet. He said, be like the man of the countryside, who goes under the tree and waits for the storm to pass, which I think leaves aside the fact if you go under the tree, you might get struck by lightning. But, the idea is, go under the tree, wait for the storm to pass, which is where the title of the book came from, which is how politicians had to maneuver within the system in a way that was other than frontal opposition sometimes, although that was part of it, to try to wait things out and be able to take their power back after the dictatorship ended, which they actually did pretty successfully, much to the chagrin of people on the left.
Yeah. It's super interesting because in cults, right, we have this thing called routinization. So the opposite of charismatic leader, a charismatic leader builds his organization. And then the first thing they have to do is they have to put people in place. And if you put effective bureaucrats in place to help you run your organization, they start bureaucrating and they start making laws and writing things down and making processes. And we used to think that routinization made you not a cult. The Mormons were the kind of textbook example for routinization. So I don't think it makes you not a cult. I think America's a cult. We just have 250 years of routinization. But basically, bureaucracy is the opposite of autocracy, or like the opposite of charismatic leadership is paperwork and red tape and rules to follow. And what I found fascinating when I was listening to your podcast interview that you did was you talked about how, like, just the local politicians doing local politician things and acting in their own best interest or in the best interest of their local constituents and sort of ignoring the national government was one of the things that helped break the dictatorship.
Yeah, I mean, historically in Brazil, it's this is another thing that makes Brazilian politics very different from American politics. Like in the United States, like it is very unlikely that you're going to resign from Congress, that you can run for mayor of Fresno, right? That is not likely to happen. In Brazil, it's it's considered better to be a mayor than to be a congressperson. And so, you might resign from Congress. You can run for mayor of a town of like 50,000 people or something. Because in Brazil, politics have historically been so concentrated both at the local level, but also power disproportionately invested in the executive branch. So you won't leave Congress to run for city council. That's the legislative branch, but you will leave Congress to run to be mayor of your hometown, maybe. And so there's always been this really powerful local element to Brazilian politics. And even at the national level, this is a bit different today, but certainly during the period I study, it's fair to say that the political class that was represented in Congress, they were all really just delegates of the 26 state. Well, now it's 26. It was fewer at the time, but of the state political classes. That is who was really being represented in Congress. So really each state, but even each town has its own political elite. And so one of the things that happened during the dictatorship is like there were kind of three ways, right, that a politician could react to the military being in power. And just to go back to the beginning a little bit, to say briefly, one thing that, like the thing that made politicians so frustrated with the generals, they supported the coup at first because they thought that, the military will get rid of the communists and then give us power back just like they always did. And they were very surprised to discover that the military did not really see them as the rightful rulers of Brazil. They saw them as a problem to be solved, right? There's this very strong sort of anti-political discourse in the military, even the Brazilian popular classes, anti-politician discourse. And they saw politicians as being corrupt and self-interested and much more interested in, developing their own careers than in, the national good, which was probably true. And so politicians were not real happy to discover that the military saw them as one of Brazil's problems that needed to be reformed. And so very quickly it got away from politicians and the military took more and more power and marginalized politicians more and more. And by 1968, it had gone from being a military dominated regime to being very much a military dictatorship, because the generals got mad at Congress and shut it down and for 9 months and, suspended habeas corpus and a bunch of other authoritarian measures. And so politicians had several ways they could react to this, right? One way was just to jump in bed with the military and enthusiastically support them. And that's what about 2/3 of the members of Congress did initially. The military dissolved all the old political parties. They founded 2 new ones. They said, we're going to have a government party and opposition party. Like everybody wanted to join the government party so much that they had to convince some senators to join the opposition party so that there could be enough to actually have an opposition. That was one approach. But the ones who were more resistant to, who were a little more uncomfortable, right? There was this option for frontal opposition, right? You would like make a bold statement and give these speeches in Congress and say this is a dictatorship, and then they would kick you out of Congress or you'd get sent to jail, and you would take a heroic stand. And that's the kind of resistance that people like, right, in retrospect, but it's not the one that was most effective. What worked the best was when politicians decided to play by the rules of the game, build sort of, focus on building their own local power base, get local politicians to ally with you because they believe that you can, bring home the bacon, and create an opposition infrastructure that way. And that's what wound up being the most effective, was having this more pragmatic approach where they played within the rules of the game. In Brazil, like it was, you had rules of the game to play within because unlike the Chilean and Argentine dictatorships, The Brazilian dictatorship never did away with elections, right? Congress was open for almost the entire dictatorship. And most positions, with the exception of some mayor positions and some senators and governors, most positions were still popularly elected. And so there was room to maneuver within the system, and politicians exploited that loophole. In Argentina and Chile, the reason why the military could just like close Congress was because in both cases, right, democracy had brought Perón back in Argentina, and democracy had elected the Marxist Salvador Allende in Chile. And so the military steps in and says, democracy failed. We need something else. In the case of Brazil, the coup was preemptive, right? It was supposedly to defeat communism and preserve democracy. So you can't say you've had this coup in order to protect democracy and then turn around and eliminate Congress and fire all the governors. And so the Brazilian generals were always constrained by the original limitations of their project and by the original discourse, which is no matter what they were doing, they had to say they were protecting democracy. There was one general who said, well, like in Brazil, what we're going to have is a relative democracy, democracia relativa, one that is suited to the educational and cultural level of our people. A nice way of saying Brazilians were not smart enough to govern themselves, so they couldn't have real democracy. But within that system, then politicians had room to maneuver. So I know that was a long answer, but
No, that was great. Because the next thing I want to talk about is like, we hear a lot about the pendulum, and I do sort of think we're in an extinction burst right now of the cult of MAGA and of just sort of a lot of stuff. But I know we're on this pendulum swing, and we're probably going to swing back. And one of the things, so for example, ICE, right? Even I got freaked out when they reported ICE got missiles the other day, which is fortunately not true yet. But like, we've been needing to regulate the Department of Homeland Security for over 20 years. Like, we have been needing to deal with so many of these holes in our government. And in my opinion, kind of the toxic patriotism that sprang up because of 9/11 and the militarism and all of this stuff. How did Brazil kind of come back? How did we see that in Brazil? I mean, I know that you have said they built a stronger democracy than America, I think. And how was that, right? Because like now we have a felon ruling our country, and Brazil's president's in jail, and I'm a little upset about that.
this is a place where I think Brazil has a completely unrecognized and really important lesson to teach the quote unquote opposition in the United States, i.e., the Democratic Party, and as much as we can say they're opposition. In that Brazil, when the military started like chipping away at civil liberties, arresting and torturing leftist activists, killing some people, from your ordinary Brazilian in the streets, there was kind of a collective yawn to that, right? And so in several elections, like in 1970, for example, in 1972, the opposition ran largely on this idea of like, we have to restore democracy. And they were absolutely demolished at the polls, to the extent where the opposition party almost had to fold because they didn't have enough people left. In 1974, there was this pivotal election where they changed their strategy. So Brazil had been undergoing double-digit economic growth each year since 1969. But the slogan of this campaign was, Brazil's doing well. Are you? And so the argument was that runaway economic growth had benefited only a few people, and the country was doing so well, but ordinary people are still living in favelas where they may not have running water or a sewage system. They're still they're still riding public transportation, can't dream of owning a car. And when the opposition started to not focus on the way that the regime was attacking democracy, and instead focus on the way that it was making everyday people's lives worse, then they started to win elections. And so in 1974, there were 22 open Senate seats, and they won 16 of them. And they went from having like less than like around 20% of the seats in Congress to having over 40%, being able to block constitutional amendments. And that happened because they changed their message. And so my application here to the US, right, is that we're having no king's protests saying that like, Trump is attacking democracy, which of course he is. But like, if you don't have time to go to protests because you're trying to work at McDonald's, Burger King, and Hardee's at the same time just to have enough money to pay your rent, then like you're probably not real worried about kings. You're probably a lot more worried about how am I going to pay the bills? And focusing a little bit more on this class issue and on the way that ordinary people are having to work harder and harder to get, not to get ahead, just to stay afloat. Maybe that's what the Democrats should be focusing on instead of no kings.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, because I mean, sort of, this is what I've been waiting for, is that, the promise of the cult is always a lie, right? Of course, Donald Trump is never going to make America better. And he hasn't even really tried, right? He's only tried to enrich himself and his cronies and seize power. And so these policies are about to start affecting his people. And in fact, ever since he's been in power, I think we've been seeing a lot of MAGA folks waking up as the policies affect them. And that is certainly, I think, one of the approaches. And I
Yeah, we can
just
hope. We can hope anyway.
yeah, like I have searched far and wide for advice, and almost everybody doing this from their own angle is saying the advice is community. We got to focus on community. We got to focus on mutual aid, like individualism. I have been wondering for a long time if individualism is what is going to get Americans in the end, especially
It's
COVID was
been
such
the
an
critique of our
interesting.
national project from the beginning, hasn't it?
Yeah. I mean, individualism and kind of this, I am I'm spending a lot of time writing about the Puritans as the original cult or the original fascists, maybe in our country. And, this so I have a list of, bad signs in gurus and then bad signs in organizations. And at the top of the list is a focus on your own uniqueness. Okay, so Bryan, thank you so much. This has been super, super helpful. I'm going to, for the readers, again, recommend your book. Can you tell us the title?
Until the Storm Passes, Politicians, Democracy, and the Demise of Brazil's Military Dictatorship, published by University of California Press.
Okay, and that can be bought from where?
So it can be purchased on Amazon. It can be published from purchased from UC Press's site. In years of sales, maybe I shouldn't say this, but it is also available as a free ebook through UC Press's site as well. So people don't even have to buy it if they want to read it.
Wow, amazing. So just a little bit of work. You could go get it, or you can buy it to support Dr. Pitts. Thank you so much. What Okay, so my last question for you is, for you as an American who knows a lot about dictatorships, what worries you the most? And where do you think maybe we go from here? Or what what would you say is a good focus for Americans right now?
What worries me the most is, I think a lot of other people have brought this up, right? Thinking about Brazil really drives it home, is that we've never had a dictatorship before. And so, like, we may not know, well, some people may not know that it's happening until it's too late, right? It's like sort of the steady erosion of democratic institutions. I mean, this has been going, like, the Republicans have been laying the groundwork for this since they started like passing those voter ID laws to make it harder to vote. The project has always been to seize power by any means necessary in order to institute a Christian nationalist agenda, and a radically libertarian economic agenda. And I think the left and sort of the centrist Democrats have put so much trust in American institutions that no institution is fail safe. Wasn't it Benjamin Franklin who said we've given you a republic, or a republic if you can keep it, right? And institutions don't hold themselves up. They don't protect themselves. And so I don't think that we have a great enough understanding here of the urgency. And I think that Brazilians do. So if you want to talk about that too, that's something else we can talk about, right? It's like the reason, Brazil had a right-wing president, very similar to Trump, for 4 years, from 2018 to 2022, who tried to start an insurrection on January 8th, 2023, to stay in power after losing an election. And Brazil's gone a very different way from what the United States did. Bolsonaro is going to jail, whereas Trump was reelected and is president again and had all his charges dropped for everything. Because Brazilians know what dictatorship is. The day after, as soon as January 6th happened, Republicans were falling all over themselves to justify it. In Brazil, all the governors flew to Brasilia, and a couple of days after, all the governors from all the political parties walked hand in hand with President Lula across the Praça dos Três Poderes, the main plaza in Brasilia behind the Congress, for a show of unified support for democracy. Brazilians have experienced dictatorship. Brazilians know that institutions do not are not, do not stand on their own, and that we have to actively fight to protect them in our own generation. And so Brazilians have created institutions that are actually capable of protecting democracy, whereas, quite frankly, I don't know that we have those. I don't know if our institutions were ever capable of standing up against something like this. In Brazil, they've built institutions that today are working.
Yeah, it's so interesting because as a former US Army officer who has deployed and sort of understands the military at a lot of levels, people keep asking me like when the military is going to step in and save us. And I just from the best I can tell, we don't have that function. Like even how you talked about like there was a political conversation in the Brazilian military, and we don't have political conversations in the American military. Like those are
Yet,
taboo.
anyway.
They're right, right. There's I always tell my audience my crystal ball's in the shop for the next 3.5 years. So like nobody really knows what's gonna happen on our sort of march to American dictatorship. What I do know is that marches always suck. And I think what you said is really one of the key things here that I have been noticing is that like like Americans, but I think very specifically white middle class America like doesn't know how to organize to protect democracy. I look at France and even the UK, and like white women there know how to organize and go after their government when they're unhappy. And we have been insulated for so long from, I think, the effects of bad government in white America in many ways that we don't actually have this, like you said, like cultural remembrance of having oppression. It's been an interesting thing for me as a, scholar of authoritarian leadership being like, well, all Americans are going to understand it differently now, right? Like going forward, we're all going to have whatever happens from here on out, have had this experience of a executive branch that is trying to use authoritarian leadership to take control.
Yeah, and I mean, you're the one, you know infinitely more about the U.S. military than I do, but sort of my feel for it is like the U.S. military so far has not had this sort of political role. It's not the role of the military to step in to save us from anything. But if the military did step in, they're probably not stepping in to save us from Trump's authoritarianism.
Right.
It's probably going to be the opposite.
I think, and I tell my people a lot that like one of the protections that we have in our military is that like, so the military is definitely a cult. I wrote that book, but it's a cult that answers to an idea, and that idea is protecting the American Constitution. And I do not believe we're going to see the military step in. I think we might see the military stand down. And in fact, we've seen that, right? Like we've seen Trump say, shoot protesters in the knee, and the military say, no. I found it very significant that the parade was such a mess, like he can't even get the soldiers to not march funny. But yeah, I think this has never happened in the American military where people have been so nervous. Like military officers have been so nervous. But I do
That's a
think
relief to me then.
yes, and also I think another thing here that's very very significant is we've just got done with 20 years of war. So our Department of Defense is about 2 million people, including civilians. There's about 18 million veterans in America, and all of us, our area of expertise is how the US loses to lower tech forces using lower tech tactics. So, and I would say like the military is very aware of that. Like the leaders of the American military are very aware of the fact that there's more combat experience outside the military by far, by like, grades than there is inside. And so hopefully this is not a fight they decide to pick. But yeah, I don't have anything comforting for people about the military other than I don't think they're going to turn and shoot us. It's very hard to convince the military to do total war on their own people.
I feel better now. It's one thing that's a little bit different from Latin American military. So something else you said, though, to kind of take us back, I guess maybe full circle, if you don't mind, to the cult discussion. Perhaps you didn't say, maybe you said it in our email exchange, although if I'm wrong, correct me, but I suspect that like being raised in a religious cult actually prepared you pretty well to do well in the military cult. And it's kind of what I've experienced with the academic cult.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to grad school, and it turned out that like there were very specific ways that I was expected to behave. There were very expected things I was expected. There were very clear things that I was expected to believe. And if I didn't do them, dire consequences would be held over me. Right? As I was a kid, I did do what I was told, or else I would burn in hell for all eternity. When I became an academic, I had, I remember I had a faculty member email me in a panic one time saying like, "Oh my God, there's a photo on Facebook of you holding a beer. You have to take that down. What if somebody sees it?" And it was the sort of like high stakes being put on every little decision you made, and then being told that, in the academy, well, if you don't do exactly as you're told, then you'll never get a tenure track faculty job, which is the academic equivalent to burning in hell for all eternity.
Yep.
And so, like, these very clear norms of behavior, and like that's
Even
why
the
I thrived in that world for a long time, because like I could be compliant and
yeah.
expected of me, and maybe have questions but not ask them.
Well, and even the language, the academic language of publish or die, right? Very, you'll be happy to know that I do talk about academia as a cult in Culting of America. In fact, I chose not to go for a PhD and instead to do my book with this 38-page bibliography, just as a popular book, because I was like, I'm not putting
Well,
my
it's your choice.
yeah, I was like, I'm not putting myself into a third environment of high control. But to your point, so in my memoir, Uncultured, it opens with me on my first day of basic training holding a 50-pound duffel bag over my head and saying, "Oh, I just joined another cult." Right. And my next thought, which is off screen, is, "Oh, I'm going to be better at it than these suckers." Right. Because, like, I know how to just tamp down my individuality and do hard stuff. Especially if it comes to like physical pain versus just like powering through. And that's, I think maybe you'll be intrigued to know I'm writing a musical. It's called Cult Baby the Musical, veterans included. And one of the things I am like riffing on is veterans and cult babies. We all have this thing that I call I can do it with a broken heart. Like no matter what is going on in our lives, like personally, professionally, or emotionally, like when it's go time, we can go. And we can like work hard. And in fact, one of the things I have been telling my audience is everyone should be getting to know their neighbors, right? Building community, talking about what you would do if ICE shows up, and pay special attention to kids who grew up in religious extremism, because we know how to do a lot of weird stuff. And we also know how to not just shut down, I think, when stuff is happening. One of the criticisms I actually get from my audience is that I think they look at me and they go like, "You're too white to not be freaking out right now." And it's, well, I've come through a lot. I grew up in a labor camp in South America, so there's been a lot of stuff. And yeah, I do kind of think, one of the things you said that is really relevant to right now is like the Christian extremists have been trying to get the White House for 50 years. And now they have gotten it. And now we are in this, and I think so. First of all of the academics say that like all cults are ultimately the same. And I think there are so many millennials that kind of lost their parents to extremism, generally of evangelical, Catholic, or Mormon flavor, kind of in the 80s and 90s with this whole push. I call us the kids who didn't get to read Harry Potter. And, a lot of us feel like we don't fit into the regular world. And now I think things are a little flipped. And if you've lived under authoritarian control of any kind, even if that's just your, patriarchal evangelical family, you're kind of triggered right now about what's going on. And I think we're all like a little scared. But I also think we have a lot of skills to survive this and contextualize it and even lead people through this than like the kids that did get to read Harry Potter. Some of these Americans who have never experienced extremism or authoritarianism of any kind, I think just are kind of, as you mentioned, like don't really have context for what is happening right now.
Well, the other advantage of those of us who grew up in high control religion that we get when we move to the left politically is, at least in my experience, it makes me very sensitive to cult-like behavior on the left as well, right? When there's a set of things you have to agree with, and those who question will be shunned, right? And no debate will be allowed because we know that we're right. I've had this debate with people on the left before. When it comes to, oh, I don't know, abortion, right? And of course, I am very pro-choice in my politics on abortion, but I'm like, you do realize that they think that it's murdering a baby, right? And so like maybe you need to engage seriously with that idea. And you do realize like they think they're right. Like they really think they're right. And my friends on the left, like, well, yeah, but we know we're right. And so like that sort
Yeah.
of unwillingness
Yeah.
to engage with other people's ideas because I know that I'm right and I don't need any, I need nothing more than knowing that I'm right. I'm like, oh, maybe we shouldn't do that on the left.
Yeah. And, this is literally what so much of my work is. And like the first thing I ever published was an essay that at first had like me on 9/11, watching the towers falling, watching my people praising God for his judgment. And, hearing the term religious extremists and thinking, what about us? But then a decade later, I'm in Afghanistan. Our soldiers have been killed, and we are doing the heroizing thing. And I, obviously will never forget standing there and being like, but they think they're right. Like they lost people too, and they think that they're right. Like if you are willing to die for an idea, you think that you are right. And I think one of the things that we don't understand about extremism, if we haven't experienced it, is that it doesn't feel bad. It feels good. It feels great to feel like you are saving the world and you are part of a mission. This is one of the reasons soldiers struggle when they leave the military, is because we're like, I went from like, I'm a missionary, what I'm doing with my life matters, to like, I'm a student, what I'm doing with my life matters, and to I'm a soldier, what I'm doing with my life matters. And then I tried to go be in corporate America with just a well-paying job that didn't actually matter that much. And I was like, this sucks, And so this thing that we have in our country, I think that the left is having a lot of purity requirements. I think the left, a lot of us that have walked away from extreme religion, still haven't deconstructed the apocalypticism and the concept that like the big bad thing is coming. And there's also a lot of sort of teleology, like the end is decided, whether that is this can't happen in America or like, oh, we're cooked, like this is done. And one of the things I've been applying to politics right now is that cults want you to think the apocalypse is just around the corner. Like we had
Yep.
songs about the bombs are incoming and the world's about to be over. And the result of that song was you were just supposed to sit down and hug your family and like wait for God to come take you. It wasn't fight back. And so one of the reasons that I do what I do and have these conversations with people like you that understand places where authoritarians have taken control before is this notion of the more you don't understand it, the more scared you are, the less likely you are to fight back. Where my job, even in the military, was to look at pilots in the face and be like, this is all the ways they're going to try to kill you today, so that they could then, respond correctly. So I really, really appreciate you coming and devoting so much of your time to this conversation. I will be reading through your book in the next couple months. So if you are on social media, I will tag you. But I have been asked a lot about resources about this. So hopefully I can send some people your way.
That'd be great.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bryan Pitts, everybody. Thank you for listening to our special episodes of Cults and the Culting of America. Don't let the bad guys get you down. Start thinking about what you are willing to sacrifice for democracy, because that is the thesis of being an American. Thanks, everyone.